If you sit still long enough, silence will begin to speak, not through words, but through a strange sensation, as if something is gently touching you from a place you once belonged to and then forgot. Albert Einstein once sat by a window like that, amid a world arguing over particles and waves, energy and space. He quietly watched light fall upon the dust in the air and asked, "I want to know what God is thinking." Not a God with human form, not a religion to believe in or reject, but a presence subtle, silent, immutable, hidden behind every equation, every death, every embrace, every whisper of wind. He called it the mind of God, a sacred blueprint that science has only grazed the edges of, a language no one can speak, but one that sometimes can be felt. Throughout his life, Einstein never stopped searching for truth, a truth that transcended mathematics, physics, and even the fear of being misunderstood. He once said, "Truth does not belong to religion, nor to science. Truth belongs only to those who dare to seek it." And perhaps, before leaving this world, he left behind something, a whisper, a secret never published, about what he called the Word of God. He didn't like crowds. He didn't care for praise. He paid no mind to being called a genius. To Einstein, the ego wasn't something to be glorified, but something to be dissolved, like morning mist when the sun rises. Those who lived close to him recalled a strange habit. Each morning, Einstein would sit quietly by the window, sip a small cup of bitter coffee, and observe the light, not artificial light, but natural light, the first rays of dawn slipping through the curtain, touching the dust in the air, forming soft, gentle beams that moved slowly, quietly. "That's when I see God most clearly," he once whispered to a friend, not with his eyes, but with the intuition of a soul listening to a music that had no sound, like standing before the ocean and saying nothing, because something inside you is remembering. Einstein once said, "The real miracle is not in what we can explain, but in what continues to exist despite all explanation." During his years at Princeton, he rarely spoke of religion in public, but in his private journals, in letters to close friends, and sometimes in the tender moments before falling asleep, he confessed something few would expect. "I've never believed in a God with a human form, but I do believe there is a vast intelligence behind it all, a living silence no definition could ever contain." It wasn't faith. It was knowing, like the way, you know, you're in love without needing any proof. And it was in these quiet moments that he began to reflect on what he called the mind of God, not a being to pray to, but a structure of infinite intelligence and quiet love, woven into the fabric of everything that exists, from the movement of the planets to the unnoticed tears of a lonely soul. And because of that, Einstein's greatest fear was not death, but dying before he could share this sacred truth with humanity. For decades, Albert Einstein has stood as an unquestioned symbol of human intellect. People asked him about the universe, about time, about light, but there was one question that the press, the academic world, and even close friends consistently avoided. Do you believe in God? Not everyone dared to ask it directly. And when they did, they often only wanted a simple, palatable answer, something tidy enough to place Einstein neatly on one side or the other of the eternal debate between faith and science. But he was never someone who belonged to either side. In a now famous letter written in 1954, a year before his death, to German philosopher and theologian Erich Gutkind, Einstein wrote, "The word God for me is nothing more than the expression and product of human weakness. The Bible is a collection of honorable but still primitive legends, and any attempt to interpret them in a metaphysical sense, is naive. That letter sent shockwaves through the world. It was later dubbed the God Letter, and both atheists and believers seized upon it as proof for their own arguments. Atheists saw it as Einstein's final rejection of divinity. Theists insisted he was merely dismissing the white-bearded God, not the existence of a higher intelligence. But perhaps no one truly understood him, because what Einstein was trying to express was never fully contained in words. It lived between the lines, in the silence between his thoughts, in a private conversation. His close friend, psychologist Gustav Bucky, once asked him directly, "Albert, what do you really think about God?" Einstein stared out the window for a long time. The late afternoon light shimmered in his eyes. And then he said, "I cannot believe in a God who rewards and punishes. But when I look at the perfection in the order of the universe, I cannot help but feel there is something far greater than any physical law." He called it the God of Spinoza, a God who requires no altar, no prayers, no attachment to doctrine, but a sacred field of consciousness where every motion has meaning, where the wind that dances across a meadow and the explosion of a distant supernova are part of the same grand symphony. For Einstein, belief was never a matter of dogma. It was a matter of feeling. He once said, "The most beautiful experience we can have is the mysterious. Anyone who has lost that sense of wonder, who can no longer pause in awe, is as good as a snuffed-out candle." And perhaps that is why he avoided debates on faith, because the deepest truths can't be defended with words. They can only be felt by the soul. But deep in his heart, Einstein carried a fear that if he didn't speak, what he had seen might forever be buried, that if he remained silent, the thing he had heard, through mathematics, through light, through intuition, what he called the Word of God, might vanish with him. And so, in the final months of his life, Einstein began to write, not a physics paper, but a manuscript that was never published, a handwritten document hidden in a secret drawer at Princeton, discovered only years later, with a single line on the first page. These words are not meant to be believed. They are only meant for someone who is listening. Einstein did not search for God in a church. He didn't look for him in 1,000-page books explaining faith. He searched in numbers, in equations, and in the silence between the heartbeats of a breathing universe. At the age of 12, Albert experienced a crisis of faith. His Jewish family had taught him to pray, to study the Torah, but one day he discovered the laws of physics Newton, Kepler, and realized that the universe wasn't chaotic, as people thought. It was programmed, so perfectly structured, it couldn't possibly be random. Behind every phenomenon, he wrote, there is order, a delicate structure. No one could have created that, unless it was born of a mind beyond comprehension. Einstein called it the cosmic code, and for the rest of his life, he tried to decipher it. That's why he became obsessed with a single goal: to find an equation that could unify everything, from photons to gravitational fields, from the motion of galaxies to the strange behavior of an electron in quantum space. Because he believed, if I can find the key, I will not only understand the universe, I will understand God. But the further he went, the more he encountered a paradox. The closer he got to the center of truth, the more helpless the language of physics became. Mathematics could describe, but it couldn't express the sacred beauty behind what was operating. He once confessed in a letter to the Academy of Sciences, the human mind can grasp the great truths of the universe, but only through limited symbols. What is, exists, beyond every equation. It was in that moment Einstein began to translate God into the language of geometry, not to control, but to understand and dissolve into. To him, light was not just electromagnetic waves. It was an invisible current of thought the universe was sending to humanity. Gravity was not just a force of attraction. It was a gentle reminder that everything is connected, and time not a linear line, but a sacred circle where the beginning and end touch like two hands in prayer. Einstein didn't speak often about God because he knew people would misunderstand. They would turn the mind of God into a religious slogan instead of listening to it as a frequency, one that only silence can truly hear. To him, God was never angry. God did not reward or punish. God simply is, like gravity, invisible, quiet, but so real that all life moves around it. And that is why, on a night near the end of his life, Einstein wrote a single line in his worn leather notebook. God does not speak in words. He speaks in symmetry. There is a paradox every physicist must face, especially when venturing into the strange world of quantum mechanics. Does reality still exist if no one is observing it? Einstein hated that idea, or rather, he feared the notion that consciousness could interfere with the nature of physics, because if that were true, then everything he had believed in, about objectivity, about natural laws, about a world that exists independently of the observer, would begin to crumble. And yet, even he couldn't deny it. In quantum experiments, the outcome changes simply because someone is watching. An electron can behave as either a particle or a wave, depending on whether it is observed or not. This was no longer a theory. It was empirical. Einstein once joked, "I like to think the moon is still there, even when no one is looking at it." Then he fell silent, because deep within, something had begun to shift. If consciousness could influence matter, then might it be the primary foundation of the universe? Could it be that what he once called the mind of God wasn't a mechanical engine, but a vast field of awareness observing itself? That question led him back to a conclusion he once resisted. Quantum mechanics is incomplete without the observer. And if consciousness is necessary for reality to exist, then this reality from planets to stars cannot exist without a greater awareness watching through everything, a form of consciousness with no body, no human language, but one that can be felt through everything that moves. Einstein began to change, not publicly, not through speeches, but quietly. In the pages of his personal journals, he wrote with more stillness, "We are not the creators of the universe, but perhaps the universe needs us to know that it exists." He gradually let go of the idea that matter is primary and started to think consciousness is not a product of the brain. The brain is just an antenna, receiving a higher frequency from an invisible field. Just as a radio doesn't create music, it simply receives waves from somewhere else. Then, he wrote a line haunting and breathtaking in its beauty. If consciousness creates reality, then God is not out there. God is the act of seeing itself, not a ruler, not a punisher, but an eternal gaze, gentle and profound, always present, always witnessing. From that moment, he began to revisit all the equations he had ever written, no longer as cold descriptions of force and mass, but as musical notations transcribing a living presence. And when he returned to the theory of relativity, he saw something he had once overlooked. In every formula, there is always an observer, and without that observer, time, space, and the universe itself cease to have meaning. That night, under the warm glow of his desk lamp, he quietly wrote one final line. "I used to think the universe needed a theory, but perhaps what it truly needs is a heart that can feel." Einstein didn't speak much about death. He wasn't a philosopher in the Eastern tradition, nor a preacher like the clergy. But once, on a quiet, rainy afternoon in Princeton, He used a simple image to speak of something that language cannot quite touch. Imagine a wave on the surface of the ocean. As long as there is wind, it exists. But when the wind stops, it doesn't disappear. It simply returns to the ocean. In that moment, he was speaking of the human being, of the soul, and of a life that never truly ends. Because to Einstein, death was not an end. It was a change of state, like a wave dissolving to return to the water. No one disappears. We simply return to where we came from. And if that ocean is God, then every soul, every gaze, every memory, every tender vibration of love is merely a temporary expression of a greater being living through us. No one is lost. No one is truly alone. And no one is forgotten. Einstein called it a profound truth, a knowing that came more from intuition than education. And, surprisingly, the closer he came to the end of life, the more he believed in the ongoing existence of consciousness, not in the traditional heaven of Scripture, but in a kind of merging with the greater being, where each soul is like a drop of water, returning to the ocean, no longer named, no longer defined. Only light and unity remain. In a private conversation, he once told historian William Hermans, "What we call the individual is merely an illusion." Though a very persistent one, he smiled, not bitterly, not with denial, but with a serene acceptance that he had never truly been separate. And the greatest comfort of all, if you are a wave, you can never be apart from the ocean. You have always belonged to it, and you will always be held by it. In his final notes, tucked inside a leather-bound brown notebook, was a short passage almost like poetry. "I do not know what will remain of me, but if anything does, let it be the light I tried to see in every human being, and in myself." He never used the word soul in a religious sense, but you could feel it in every word. He spoke about the universe. There was always a quiet longing for a place we once belonged to, and when he looked at the light dancing on dust in the air, his eyes didn't just see a physical phenomenon. They saw traces of something sacred whispering, "You have always been a part of me." There was an equation that changed the world. Just 3 characters, but enough to shatter every old belief about matter and energy. Einstein once said it was a door, but he wasn't sure where it opened to. In the final years of his life, as his health declined, but his mind remained sharp, Einstein would sit alone for hours in front of a blank page, repeating a question he never shared publicly. If energy cannot be destroyed, then can consciousness, also a form of vibration, truly disappear? He began to look again at his own equation, not to revise it, but to listen to it, as if between the lines of formulas, a forgotten melody still echoed. If mass and energy are 2 sides of the same coin, then perhaps consciousness is the third side we've yet to recognize. Not a scientific hypothesis, but a deep inner knowing that we humans are not just thinking biology. We are a ray of light inhabiting a finite body. He began to refer to consciousness as a subtle form of energy, so delicate that current instruments cannot detect it, yet powerful enough to move through time and space. Like the photon, consciousness has no mass, but it carries information. It needs no location, yet may exist in parallel realities. Einstein didn't just believe that consciousness doesn't vanish. He believed it continues its journey, like the light from a dead star, still reaching our eyes. Today, I cannot prove it with an equation. He wrote, but I feel it, like sensing the presence of light, even when my eyes are closed. To Einstein, death was no longer deep sleep. It was a shift in frequency. When the body ceases to function, consciousness doesn't vanish. It simply transforms into another state, like vapor becoming cloud, like a voice that no longer echoes in the room, but still lives in the memory of the one who heard it. In a long-lost manuscript, Einstein wrote with a trembling but resolute hand, "If consciousness is energy, and energy cannot be destroyed, then we have never truly died." He began to see that what science had long been missing throughout its history was the observer, not as a secondary variable, but as the center of all reality. Consciousness is not a byproduct of the brain. The brain is only a transmitter. Consciousness is the source, a form of light not housed in the body, but using the body to experience itself. In the end, Einstein was no longer concerned with whether the soul was real. He pondered something deeper. If consciousness continues after we die, then the responsibility of how we live may be far greater than we ever imagined. Late winter. Nisantius 24. Princeton was cold, dry. Twisted branches outside the window trembled gently in the wind. Inside the small room, soft light fell upon a man worn by the weight of years, but whose eyes still shone with the same brilliance as when he first saw the equation E MC2 appear on the blackboard. Albert Einstein, 75 years old. His body had grown weak, but his mind refused to surrender, and his soul seemed to be preparing for another kind of journey. A close friend who visited him that day later recalled, "Einstein sat in silence for a long time, then looked at me with an expression that was both solemn and serene, and asked, 'Do you know what I've feared most in life?' The friend stayed silent. Einstein took a slow breath and said, 'Not death, but dying without ever speaking the truth I've known, without leaving behind the truth I've felt not through science, but through silence.' All his life, Einstein had avoided theological declarations. He didn't want to become the figurehead of a spiritual movement, nor did he want science tied to what current tools could not yet prove. But in the final days of his life, he realized silence could also be a form of betrayal, because if he, the man who had stood at the edge of reality, who had come to understand that consciousness does not disappear, but transforms, who had sensed that a great intelligence is perceiving all things, if he said nothing, then who would? He reached for an old notebook, turned to its last blank page. His hand trembled, but his writing remained steady. "I am not a religious man. I do not belong to any faith, but I know, as surely as I know that light always travels faster than sound, that death is not an end. It is a form of return." He did not use the word God in the conventional sense. To him, God was not a person, not even a concept, but a vast space into which every soul dissolves when it becomes still enough, a field to which all life is connected, a still point where the self disappears and only truth remains, and perhaps he had already seen it. Not after death, but just before departing, the night nurse on duty recalled that, as Einstein could barely breathe, he turned toward the window where the first morning light touched the white snow, and whispered, "I'm ready, not to end, but to see more clearly." In an envelope left on the desk, Einstein wrote to his friend, "Don't publish this right away. Don't try to convince anyone. But if, one day, humanity begins to see the limits of matter, let these words find them." And at the bottom of the letter, a final line nearly blurred by water. "Truth does not need to be shouted. It only needs to be heard." In silence, there were no sobs in the room where he passed, only light, and a strange feeling his friend would later describe. "I didn't feel him leave. I felt him dissolve, like a wave returning to the ocean. And in that moment, I felt him more clearly than ever before." All his life, people kept asking Einstein, "Do you believe in God? Do you think the soul exists? Do you believe in an afterlife?" And he would always smile, never answering in the way they expected, because to him, Those were never the right questions. The real question was never, does God exist? But rather, if God truly exists, how am I living under that gaze? Einstein once wrote, "We act as if everything is random, but if every thought, every emotion, every vibration is a form of energy, then nothing truly disappears. And if nothing is lost, then every word we speak, every act we take, leaves a permanent imprint on the structure of the universe." That's why what troubled him most wasn't death, but living without awakening, living without knowing that even the smallest action ripples across a vast web, larger than we could ever imagine, living without realizing that we are not alone and we are not free to live as though we affect no one. He believed that if one day science could prove consciousness continues after death, the important response would not be to celebrate or debate, but to change how we live. If you knew you wouldn't disappear, would you still dare to do something meaningless? If every thought left a vibration, would you still so easily feed hatred? If death is just a door, would you still use fear as an excuse to postpone love? And so, in the quiet of his final years, Einstein left behind one of his greatest truths. The meaning of life is not in understanding the universe, but in learning how to live in connection, to know we are not separate, to know that every person we meet is a drop in the same ocean, the one we will all return to. Maybe you're watching this late at night, while the world seems to be asleep. Just you and one lingering question. Is there something in me that will continue even when this body is gone? If you've ever felt like you knew something no one taught you, if you've ever felt a single hug heal more than any medicine, if you've ever cried and didn't know why, then maybe you've touched the vibrational field of immortal memory, where soul, love, and light never disappear. Einstein never said we must become saints, only that we must become human beings who dare to listen to the sacred within. Because, as he once wrote, not everyone who is silent is unaware of the truth, and not everyone who speaks is truly alive. As this long journey comes to a close, remember, the question isn't whether God exists. The question is, am I living in a way that is worthy? If God is quietly watching,